I hope everyone had a refreshing break and some great conversation over coffee time. Now, we're ready to continue with our last highlight of the day. Keynote 5, Medical Open Network for Artificial Intelligence, MONAI. Empowering healthcare innovation through open source AI frameworks. This session will explore how open source AI frameworks are transforming the healthcare landscape and accelerating innovation in medical imaging and data science. To begin the session, may I invite Dr. Piyalitt Ittichaiwong, Sirirat Hospital, PhD students in biomedical engineering and imaging science, and instructor at the Sirirat Informatics and Data Innovation Center.
Okay, thank you. It's my guest honor as moderator to introduce our esteemed speaker for today, Professor Jorge Cardoso. Professor Jorge graduated from USC College London. Then he is currently leader in artificial intelligence at King College London and also AI London Center, where he leads high-impact research in big data analytics, quantitative radiology, and value-based healthcare. Notably, he is co-founder of MONAI, which is the largest world-leading open-source framework for AI in medical imaging, developed in partner with NVIDIA. Please join me in warmly welcome Professor Jorge Cardoso to the stage.
Okay, now that works. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jorge. I'm from King's, from London. And I have a couple of roles, including also being the CTO of the London AI Center. But for the purpose of this talk, I'm also highly involved in open source. And for many years, I've been a big contributor and proponent of open source, primarily in medicine, where obviously the impact of having code that is available to all and contributed by all is super important. And today I'm going to talk about some of that journey, the platforms that are needed to make AI a success in healthcare, and how we have basically already transformed the contributions of the community and how they are currently accessible. I don't think the slide changing is changing, but do you mind changing the slide for me, please? Do you mind just moving to the next slide while you fix that? Yeah. Okay, so anyway, so as we all know, the reason we're all here is because healthcare is probably one of the most important parts of our lives, right? So if you look at something like the GDP of the world, healthcare is now accounting to more than 10% on average of the world's GDP, right? This is a pretty substantial figure, and it's also a figure that is going up slowly over time. And the reason that this is going up slowly over time is because we all find healthcare to be incredibly important, but also the quality of healthcare that we are providing to our patients is poised to improve, and we want to make it better every day. But by improving the quality of care, it also comes increased costs, and with those increased costs makes healthcare less affordable. If you also look then at the usage of the current expense of healthcare, what we're seeing is that because we are collecting more data, we're doing more complicated analysis of our patients' information, of the patients themselves, you end up in this situation where physicians are having burnout, and the quality of care gets harmed by doing all of this. Also, because physicians are highly stretched, you end up in a situation where you end up with diagnostic errors, which are currently one of the biggest causes of death in a hospital setting, is because clinicians make mistakes. What we're also seeing at the same time is that we have a series of medical products, medical devices, that are flooding the market. For example, just in 2023, we had more than 150 medical devices being approved by the FDA. And this is just a reflection of the hype and the push that has happened in the AI world, primarily on the commercial setting, to make these solutions available in the clinic. So there's now solutions for almost everything. The other part that I also found quite fascinating is if you just look at data as a whole, right? Healthcare represents roughly 1/3 of every data set collected worldwide, right? 1/3 of the data collected in the world comes from healthcare. And this to me was a bit mind-boggling, primarily given that you have YouTube and Twitter and all the social networks and et cetera, right? Healthcare is the most data-rich part of our society, by far. Oh, the pointer is working again, great. So, and when we think about AI in healthcare, right, there's really many areas that we need to think about in terms of the areas where we see AI being applied. Obviously, we all think about the first one. We think about patient care as being the most important one. And that's where we are doing diagnosis and prognosis and therapeutic inference and finding what's the best medication or intervention for patients. That's kind of what we think about when we think about AI in healthcare. But obviously, there's really a lot more. You have clinical efficiency. So these are all the tools that are now being used, for example, AI scribes, right, which are listening to conversations between doctors and their patients and converting that into structured notes that can then be appended to the patient electronic healthcare records. It could be any form of pre-processing that happens prior to you seeing your patients so that you can see them more effectively. You also have drug development. This is a big, big area. And drug development comes all the way from what is called preclinical and phase 0, phase 1 research, right, where you're basically building models from the bottom up that do protein folding, that understand the cell, understand specific pathways. Those are super important. But then also very late in the drug development stage, this is the phase 2s and phase 3s of clinical trials, when you try the drug in humans and you're trying to show that the drugs are efficacious. In that situation, AI is being used to improve our ability to collect information and make it available during the assessment of those medications. Then you have the operations of the hospital itself, right? How do we organize a hospital? How do we deliver care? How do we make sure that we have enough doctors and nurses available at the time that the patients are needed? How do we make sure that we are booking the right number of appointments and taking into account the patients that might apathetically not attend their appointments? How do we do all of these things in an optimal way? And if you then put all of this together, right, you end up with this notion of value-based healthcare, which is how do we build hospital systems and care systems that are focused on two things. How do we deliver the most quality that matters to patients by the least amount of costs, right? And in order to do this, we need to look at the patient holistically, not at each event, but at the full patient journey, right? And only when you do that, do you get to a point of AI making the impact that we want. And what we are also seeing is this transformation on the algorithmic side themselves, right? So many years ago, when people were building neural networks for many, many different applications, and actually most of the medical devices that exist nowadays are still based around these kinds of technologies, right? We have these kind of class of algorithms that I like to call single-purpose or single-task algorithms, where you're basically giving some input data to a neural network that you train to do one single task. That could be diagnosing someone, is there breast cancer, is there no breast cancer, does this patient have tuberculosis or not, right? Detecting emphysema, any of those things are very much single task algorithms that are trained on a specific data set built for a specific purpose. So you have this one model for each application type solution, which is obviously very expensive to develop, but it can work really well if that's the thing that you want to do. But this class of models doesn't really look at the data more broadly, right? So we need to start thinking about how do we make this more encompassing. With these kind of algorithms, you can really do a lot of things, right? You can already build some early generative models and syntactic data. You can start segmenting organs so that you can deliver radiotherapy better. You can understand the uncertainty of the predictions. You can detect abnormalities, detect specific pathologies. You can really do quite a lot with these kind of algorithms, right? But again, they are built on this assumption that you collect a data set specifically to solve for one task. And after you do, you move on and you solve for a new task. Then it started the phase of having software helping you do your job better than what we could before. So the software tooling itself, this is from the 2016, 2017 onwards, right? When we got to around 2019, 2020, what we saw was toolkits like PyTorch and MONAI, which I will talk a lot more about it, which is you can think about it as the extension of PyTorch to medicine. really started providing a series of capabilities that acted a little bit like a software development expert, right? So rather than having to have the absolute best machine learning engineers doing what they're supposed to do and building the architectures and optimizing parameters and training these models and doing all of that complicated stuff, we have basically a process of discovery automation and model automation where you just say, here's my data, just train whatever you think is best and find the best model to do what you're supposed to do, right? So you're actually removing a lot of the human factor from the development by pushing the human, that development factor to the software itself. So the software has been developed to optimize itself for the purpose of the task that we have in mind. The next stage, and this was in late 2022 with some more impactful papers coming in 23, where people were starting to build the first foundation models of medicine. These were models that were primarily used around imaging data, because imaging is one of the main areas of research in AI anyway. And 2D images with things like chest x-rays and OCT or fundus imaging, because they are naturally 2D images, they would extend naturally from the technologies that were built for standard computer vision, right? Normal vision algorithms that you would have out there. So this was the first time that people were building these foundation models trained in a self-supervised way, and a same model trained on this data was then able to answer multiple questions. So you would be able to ask what diseases the patient have, what's going to happen to the patient, how they're going to evolve, are they going to transition to, in this case, macular degeneration. But also by learning these things, the models will also learn a structure in the data that would then allow you to predict weirder things, like can you develop Alzheimer's disease from your eyes? Can you develop heart failure from your eyes, right? So there's a lot more signal in that information, in that data, that we were suddenly starting to pick up when we were looking at data at scale, right? So you see the situation where training a model to solve for multiple tasks means that the model needs to learn something else about the anatomy, about the organ, about the pathology that allows it to then suddenly be able to answer these strange questions, right? And this is where the magic really started happening. The next stage was multi-organs, right? So we went from one image of the retina to multiple, for example, images of different parts of the human body. And the same model will now be looking at everything from your gut to your brain, to your eyes, to cancer, to your prostate. So these models were then just learning to look at images like our radiologists do, right? But again, they were limited to one type of data. They were mostly around images. And what happened just after this was, as you can expect, the multi-model foundation models started popping up. They are still very much at their infancy. But the premise here is that you are able to train these models using all the data that is available to you in a hospital, including imaging, including all of these genetic data, EHR data, omics, everything else, to be able to answer multiple questions about what's going to happen to these patients, what are their most likely diagnoses, who's at high risk, and also finding patterns that you wouldn't find otherwise. So I've been talking about all of this as kind of a primer to software and to platforms. And the reality is that all of these models are progressing at a massive pace, right? The theoretical efficiency is there. We can do incredible things, right? If you look at the papers out there, you would have probably thought that we have solved medicine, right? We can diagnose everyone, prognose everyone, but the reality is really not there, right? There's still a lot more to do. And the reason that we haven't reached that point is because there is this chasm, this gap between what we can do in the lab with certain assumptions on what the data looks like, on what the platforms look like, on how do we deliver the results, and what happens in the real world. It's just, there's a gigantic gap. And either every single place in the world, every single place, every single hospital, every single healthcare system will need to solve these problems, or we build platforms that are built around open source so that we can solve them once and solve them for good. So that's one of the reasons why, and on top of many other things that I do on the research side and building these models that I was describing before, I also have been focusing very much on building these platforms and really thinking about how they should look like from the ground up. So one of the key things that we have built is this thing called MONAI is called the Medical Open Network for AI. The name came from the fact that we didn't want it to be only a software, but we were looking at it as a consortium, as a group of people that came together to define standards on how we should approach software in medicine. So it's really this community that tries to implement best practices, and best practices include software, and there's a software component to it, obviously, but also includes best practices on how to validate, how to train, how to deploy, how to label data, how do you integrate into surgical navigation systems, like all of the things that you might want to do with healthcare data and intelligence would be captured by MONAI. So it started 7 years ago between King's and NVIDIA at that time. We had a very popular open source toolkit at that time. NVIDIA also had theirs. We kind of thought it was a bit silly for each one of us to be doing our own thing. We decided to come together. We built MONAI, and then since this became this pretty large consortium. These are the official members at the moment, but we have contributors from all over the world, more than 5 million downloads at the moment, which is pretty impressive for something that comes from healthcare. And it really became the standard upon which many of the startups out there have built their models, have built their technologies, is really well executed pieces of software, very well validated, very well tested, achieves all the quality management system specifications and documentation that is necessary, so it's done properly. And it gives you a very strong foundation upon which you can build your hospital infrastructure, including the algorithms on one side, the AI models, but also the rest of the infrastructure in terms of how do you connect to multiple data types, how do you fetch data, how do you transform it, how do you harmonize it, how do you deploy, how do you actually make the models available in day-to-day clinical care, how do you label data. All of those things are captured by MONAI and its multiple sub-packages. And it was really a way for us to provide this tool to the community so that the community could build upon it and can start building tools that were sustainable and that were implementing these standards. For example, if you want to load something like a medical image, which sounds like something that is trivial, the medical imaging standard, DICOM, is a very well-known standard and everyone uses it, but it's surprisingly complicated when you go into some of the details. And if everyone was to solve for some of those edge cases of loading DICOM data, you would actually have quite a lot of trouble. And then what would happen is if you try to build your startup on top of your own DICOM data loader, something as trivial as that, right, is very likely going to fail in some random place because you hit that edge case which you didn't account for. And MONAI, for example, implements that and implements that really well in a way that it's done once and is done well. The other part that I think is really interesting is when we start thinking about this software toolkit, right, we also should start thinking about the life cycle of what does AI look like in a hospital setting, the life of these AI models, right? We might start by doing some research or some development. After you develop this algorithm, you will deploy it in the clinic. You might try it on patients. Maybe you don't try it on patients live right now. You might want to try it in what we call shadow mode, where the algorithms are working kind of behind the scenes and extracting information just to make sure that they're doing the right thing. We then need to build monitoring systems to make sure that they are not harming patients, that they're working. And if we find that something is not working well enough, how do we then build the improvements on top of it, right? How do we know, okay, I now have this subset of the patients for which the algorithms didn't work very well. How can I now take the algorithm back and say, look, here's more data, the ones that I know you haven't answered the questions really well so far. How can you then improve the algorithm? And it's only when you start putting all of these pieces together that you can get to the point of algorithms that work in the real world, because this idea that I'm going to do it in my lab somewhere in the US, in Europe, and then bring it to Asia or vice versa, right? And it will just work. That just doesn't happen. And there are multiple ingredients here that are necessary, right, for you to be able to deliver on these platforms. Every site, and I've been visiting a couple of really cool places already here in Thailand, a couple of leading hospitals, and it's super important that we start thinking about how do we make our data ready for research, right? How do we build the platforms that can do that? How do we build the ethics and governance frameworks that allow you to do AI development at the pace that is necessary, rather than taking 2 years for you to get the ethical approval like it happens already in many other parts of the world? How do you get the right compute? And how do you build the collaborations to allow you to do this more broadly? So when you start thinking about how do you bring this open source stack and how do you make it more useful, you basically get into this point where you're trying to build platforms that allow you to solve for this thing that I like to call the n-square problem, which is if I am an innovator and I want to build a startup to solve for a clinical problem, I will need to solve a bunch of problems myself, right? How do I integrate? How do I deploy? How do I validate? How do I improve? I need to do all of these things. Why would I solve all of these? And then the next innovator needs to solve the same thing. And the next one needs to solve the same thing. It makes no sense, right? If we build platforms, and if these platforms are built on top of open source, then each one of the sites can own the platforms, and you can solve the problems once, and then everyone can just utilize the platforms to validate what they need to validate. Platforms can also give you the part that is often missing. So if you go to a remote part of the world or a more deprived part of a country, it's often the case that locals and the local teams might not have the expertise to even understand what they can and cannot do. Right? They're just afraid of implementing these technologies. And often by doing so, they end up harming patients. Right? So you can if you build these platforms, and again, if the platforms themselves have the right capabilities, you can even put the quality control, quality assurance, due diligence, regulatory approval, all of those things can be part of the platform. Right? You can say, a little bit like an app store where you say these apps are validated, these ones are not. And this validation happens in a centralized governmental institute, for example, that says this is what's been approved for the country. Right? So platforms are incredibly important to give people the confidence that they're not doing the wrong thing. Then you obviously use them for deploying in the clinic. In this case, you are deploying algorithms in live clinical systems. For example, if it is an imaging model that is doing some radiological image analysis or detecting tuberculosis on patients here in Thailand, right? You don't want to have to wait for the algorithm to run. You want the data to be acquired, algorithm to run immediately as soon as the data is acquired. So at the time that I sit down to look at the image or the patient or interact with the patient, the results should be there. And I should be able to then use that result to assess the patient, decide what to do next, but also to tell the algorithm if something went wrong. So the idea here is that not only we are building the infrastructure, but also if you go back to those foundation models that I was describing before, where a single model can now solve for multiple tasks. In my personal opinion is that we're now at the brink of this situation where each site will be able to utilize these foundation models and solve many of the problems themselves, rather than having to rely on point solutions built by many startups out there that are just building one thing. Then obviously the next stage is that you need to do some post-market surveillance, so you need to make sure that the algorithms are actually working. You need to allow clinicians to report if they're not working, and you need to do this prior to deployment, during live deployment, so when you're caring for patients, but also doing it post-deployment. So when you look at historical data, you look at your population and you say, is my algorithm well calibrated? Is it biased, right? Is it giving me too many false positives or too many false negatives? And can you change that calibration effect so that we get a much better result at the end, right? Also, is the performance of the model itself drifting, right? Is it changing over time? And if so, what can you do to address it? And I think this is also where these new words that keep coming out, right? The new cool thing now is agentic AI, right? But this is really those areas where we need to start thinking about building these technologies from the ground up. If we do have foundation models that understand this data really well, can we start building agents and models that can, for example, act as guardrails, that can tell us if something is going wrong, right? That are always there to monitor how things are working, right? So when we think about some of these technologies, we need to think about them more broadly. They're not just crawlers that crawl through your hospital to find things. They can have very practical and tangible solutions that can only be developed when you're building upon these really large foundation models and open source software. And what you see is situations like this, right? This is a very obvious situation of post-market surveillance where, for example, a radiologist is receiving some image, the algorithm is automatically writing some report, and the clinician is saying, oh, right, this one is correct, fine. This one is incorrect. I'm going to change something in the report, right? I disagree with what the algorithm is doing. So automatically, you see the output of the algorithm being validated by a human, which means you're keeping the safety and the governance around it. The human is providing automated feedback to the algorithm when the algorithm is wrong, which means the algorithm is figuring out when it's wrong. And you're suddenly also creating training data for the next iteration of the algorithm, right? It's like a 3-in-1. And again, this can only happen if the platforms are there and are enabling those kinds of use cases. So here, you have a safe way to deploy algorithms that is automatically being monitored, that is approved by a human being, and can iteratively be improved by the quality of the data that we're acquiring and by having clinicians monitoring that labeling. The last step, I mean, there's another one, but the last major step is what I like to call these data discovery and model development process, which sounds weird to be here, but what I mean is, if you're starting to build the platforms to enable AI, because everyone wants that to happen, right? Suddenly you realize that digital health, just the fact that data is digitized and is available for AI model training, there's so much more that you can start doing with the same data, right? Even if that thing is not AI by itself, right? This is an example where we were using the data models and the data sets and the databases that we were building, the data lakes that we were building to deliver AI in our hospitals in London, and using the same data, for example, to explore the drug usage and escalation, those escalation in hospital settings. We are able to see, for example, these were the medications that were being used, but actually, if you were on this medication, you would have to come to the hospital on average 4 times for them to get the right dosage, right? And this kind of information sounds very simple, and many of you are probably shocked that we don't yet know these things about our hospitals, but we don't. And knowing that this medication requires 4 visits means that we should try to figure out better ways of getting the right dosage earlier so that patients get the right dosage sooner and they use the services less. That's cheaper and better, right? So suddenly, because the data was all there, you can start answering these questions. You can also start answering even stranger questions. For example, if I just give you data like this, where you say patient X has moved from A&E to an assessment ward, and then from the assessment ward exited the hospital at this other time, right? This is really simple data. This is dumb data, right? Anyone would say, I mean, this is completely useless. But actually, if you have something like this, you can know where every single patient is in your hospital right now, right? Which is something that most people don't know. Most hospitals don't know where their patients are. They're somewhere. They don't really know where. But more than that, you can then start predicting where they will be tomorrow or in a week's time. And that means you can make sure that you have the right number of doctors and nurses, but not too many, because too many is a waste, right? How do you do resource management when you suddenly have access to these data, right? So again, platforms and open source, if you implement them for a purpose, you always need to think about what else could you be doing with the same data, and what else could you use to optimize your clinical systems. We were using this, and again, there's another part which is I found super, super interesting, which is what happens when you have the right scale. If you now have these platforms and they're implemented not in a hospital, but at the national level, suddenly certain signals that would be super weak in one hospital become very important nationally. For example, during COVID, we were just counting the number of times clinicians were using flu-like symptoms, coughing and fever and all of these things when writing discharge letters for patients that were coming to the hospital, right? We're just counting words, right? How many times they were using these things. And suddenly, by counting these at the national level, you would get these histograms, right? The number of times this happened every day. And by doing this nationally, we could find that the cases of COVID were going up before the government knew, 3 or 4 days before, because we were doing it at the national level, right? So you were going beyond epidemiology and really going through early warning systems, because you had a lot more signal coming from the fact that you were doing this at the national level with the same platforms, right? Obviously, for you to do this, you need to adhere to all the international standards. You need to be able to put the data into formats that are acceptable and usable and reusable throughout the world. And there's a bunch of them, which anyone working in healthcare will tell you what they are. And MONAI supports many of these, right? So there are things that you just get out of the box. If you also do this, if every country on earth would use the same standards, and again, these standards exist. I mean, they change every decade. There's a slightly new version of every standard coming up. But if we manage to converge on these standards, and the world is converging on some of the ones that are written there at the top, suddenly you can also collaborate. For example, we have a couple of proof of concepts going on at the moment, for example, between London and BDMS and Piyalitt here in Thailand, where we're training AI algorithms on data across the 2 countries without the data having to move. Because if the data is formatted in the same way here and over there, you can just build a federated learning network. This is a way for you to train algorithms in a distributed way without having to have the data move around and with the ethics in place to do it. You could train these models across frontiers and then have the outcome, the output of that model, which is often a research tool. It could also be an industrially developed model. It could be a startup trying to do the same thing. You then have a model that would work across multiple populations, and you can extend that network much more broadly than just 2 countries. You can do it for any other countries on Earth that might want to participate in that training. And this only requires that hospitals, again, adopt certain data standards, adopt platforms, which again brings you back to open source. If platforms are open source and they're freely accessible and they become the standard, then if different sites implement those, then suddenly they become available to everyone and they enable you to do this at scale. And the last part of all of this, without trying to dwell on it for too long, is the notion of bringing it back to policymakers, to the public, to communities, right? We all want AI to change people's lives, primarily in healthcare. Right? This is, if you ask anyone in the street, they would all say yes. But they will also all bring concerns, right, about their privacy, about dehumanizing medicine, about policymakers being afraid of sovereignty and having the control over their own infrastructure and platforms, right? There's all of these concerns, and being able to do things via open source and open platforms where everyone that is trying to contribute and improve on those platforms is contributing globally. And the best practices developed in one country can then permeate to another country. But all countries are also sovereign in a way that they will all own the software because it's open source. Anyone can do whatever they want with it, right? Then suddenly you are building the infrastructure that will give patients the confidence that is needed to be able to accept AI and the benefits that it will bring. And hopefully with these kinds of technologies, we can build a much better healthcare system for everyone. So just to conclude, I think the message that I'm trying to convey today is multifold, right? First of all, that AI models are commoditizing how we look at healthcare data. And with the advent of foundation models, the amount of skills necessary to build solutions are getting less and lesser, right? Nowadays, everyone talks about vibe coding. Vibe coding is making development and programming more available to everyone, right? We're probably going to get to a same place in terms of developing models in healthcare. But obviously, if we're doing it in healthcare, the stakes are much bigger, right? If I'm developing some app to show to a friend of mine on my laptop, like who cares if a thing breaks? But in healthcare, that's not true. Right? We need something that works. And the way you fix it is by allowing people to vibe code, but then providing the infrastructure to validate, to test, to deploy, to make sure that what you've done is done correctly, right? So again, platforms allow you scalability with the right constraints that give you the confidence that is needed. These foundation models will keep getting better. That's just a reality, right? And the fact that healthcare is becoming increasingly digitized, and we will all need to go through the process of going from analog to digital more and more, right? If you are writing reports by hand on some piece of paper and scanning it, we will need to find better ways to make it digital. But when it does, these platforms and open source are basically the only scalable solution that will give you all of the capabilities and the requirements that are needed in healthcare. And with this, thank you very much, and I would love to take some questions.
Hello. Thank you very much, Professor George. I think we have time for 2 or 3 questions. Okay, so anyone have a question? Anyone? Okay, sure.
Hi, Professor Josh Piyalitt. Just want to understand the current stage of development of MONAI.
Yeah.
How long has it been developed? What's the current status, and what's the plan for the future?
So MONAI started almost 7 years ago. It's been developed since. There's a huge, I think we now have almost 100% test coverage, really well documented, professionally developed by professional software developers, and is now in its kind of pretty old version in a way, right? It's a very mature piece of software. It's been used in medical devices. So in a way, it's a very useful kind of foundation. MONAI has a series of side projects, or sub-projects, I would say, that focus on specific subtopics. For example, there is MONAI Generative for generative AI. There's MONAI Label for you to label data using AI-assisted labeling tools. There's MONAI Deploy for you to deploy algorithms in the clinic. There's MONAI Stream, which is for data streams, for example, surgical navigation and instrumentation. There's many, many different sub-packages, and those sub-packages at different levels of maturity. Right? Some of them are very mature, some of them are less mature, but the MONAI core, which is the main algorithmic stack, that's super, super mature. Currently, the community is, as I was saying, is big. We have contributors from all over the world. But we're always trying to search for more contributors because, as you can imagine, the more ownership the community has of the software, the less is driven by kings and by NVIDIA putting resources and developing it, right? The more it's going to become an internationally recognized standard and something that will survive anything that might happen, right? So the hope is that in the next years, and that's the state that we want to get into, where we build more local communities across multiple geographies, where all of these geographies are contributing to the code base. So that is not seen as something that these weird Europeans have done, right? Like, it's something that is accepted by everyone. So that's really going to be the next few years, is to convert MONAI from something which was done by, in the great majority, by a bunch of software developers in the US and Europe, right? And trying to make it something that is accepted and owned by everyone.
How do you see MONAI and healthcare startups working together?
So there's many, many examples. So MONAI is Apache 2 license, means as long as you quote it somewhere in your documentation, not even publicly, you can just use it and do whatever you want. There's no IP ownership of the MONAI team. So it's just a tool that you can use, similarly to what you would do if you were to use PyTorch to build your AI models. So in a way, MONAI is there as a tool that you can use, that you can benefit from, and there's nothing that you need to contribute back. We would like startups to contribute more without having to break their own IP and things that they own, right? So I think I think in the last few years, we've already seen quite a lot changing in that front. So some of the early startups that were building their products, their medical devices using MONAI, more and more of them are contributing some parts of the code base that they've developed, which were initially their IP, and they're contributing it to MONAI because they are parts that are not their edge or that will make them go beyond their competition. Ooh, he's blinking. So that's already happening. But it's something that I think is interesting, where we are going to be moving from a situation where we are going from these single modality-specific or task-specific models to foundation models. And when these foundation models are there and available to the general public, to the general researchers, right, how much of the development is going to, and the value created by a startup, how much of that is going to be around the infrastructure, around the evidence, around the demonstrations that is doing the right thing, and how much of it is actually technology that you will be able to develop yourself, right? So this is something that I don't think is defined. I don't think anyone knows, not just in medicine, but in all of healthcare, right? People keep building startups, and OpenAI keeps destroying startups by basically adding a new capability in their tool, right? This happens all the time. And I think the same thing is going to happen in medicine, and it's going to be a bit of a cat and mouse game until people find what is the value that they're contributing to the community, right? This is not a software question, it's more of a how do we work in medicine, what do we want out of it? So I think it's going to be a beautiful next couple of years where we will explore this.
I think our last question. Okay.
Hi. Hi, Professor Vibhu from KMTL. So where do you see the next medical breakthroughs in AI medical imaging? Are we actually heading towards that? And are there any suggestions for the newcomer, new researcher, medical doctors?
I would say that in medicine, we often have received too much hype from general computer science in terms of how to do AI. And because what we've seen, for example, in language models is that scale pretty much solves everything. But the reality is that scale only solves everything if you do have the compute scale, but also if you have the amount of data necessary to achieve that scale. And we often forget that medicine has a series of very weird particularities to it, right? Our data is strange. It's collected with these machines that do weird things. Every country does things differently, right? The clinical protocols change, the priors change, guidelines change, the medications change, right? So we're not going to solve the problem with just scale. Don't get me wrong, scale is super important, but it's not going to be just scale. And maybe I'm just getting old, but I really like thinking that we need to go back to what makes medicine medicine, what makes biomedical engineering, like knowing how the data is collected. How do we go back to that so that we put the right priors on these algorithms, so that they make use of that knowledge that we have, that we build over the years? We often forget about all of this. And I really think that's important, because only with those pieces of information, only with those priors, can we then constrain the problem so that the problem becomes solvable with the amount of data that is possible to acquire in medicine, right? We will never be in a situation where we will have 1 trillion tokens in medicine. That's not going to happen. It does not exist, right? And because of that, we need to put the right priors, to build the right structures around it. So I think we need to figure out what those are and bring them back to AI in healthcare so that it becomes a more global and generalizable tool.
Thank you. And finally, I have my personal question for you. Why you select to do the open source, not the closed source like OpenAI or the Gemini?
Nothing here has said that you cannot build foundation models that are closed, right? Same way that OpenAI has built closed source models, but we do have, I think it's healthy to have open source models because it forces the incumbents that have the private models to move differently. But today's talk was not about the models, it was about everything else, the software, the platforms, right? We already have quite a lot of trouble nowadays with proprietary patient electronic healthcare records. Every hospital has a different thing, every hospital implements a different thing. And this was at the stage where healthcare was moving very slowly, right? It took 20, 30 years for hospitals to convert and to become digital. AI is moving so quickly that I think what many countries have recognized is if they go for private solutions, if they use closed source, they might get stuck in specific contracts with infrastructure that is not evolving, it's not doing what it's supposed to do. So open source for me is a way to make sure that people are free to innovate, right? There's so many people that are so keen to build stuff, to make things work, right? To contribute. And gathering all of this, to me, is what we should be doing as a medical community. So I really think that that's what we should be working on as a group of people that care about our patients.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor George, for your inspiring session. I know you all have more questions. Please feel free to ask Professor after our closing ceremony. So that concludes the Sirirat SixMIThackMed Hacking Medicine 2025 conference. Before you leave, please take a moment to scan the QR code that are shared on the screen for the feedback for today's event. Your kind suggestion will help us make our future events better. If you'd like to stay and chat, please feel free to mingle and continue the conversation here. Thank you all once again. I'm Femi Napat Kasem Tamakun. On behalf of the Faculty of Medicine, Sirirat Hospital, it's truly been a pleasure to be your host today. Thank you and have a wonderful evening. We're looking forward to see you again next year. ขอบคุณค่ะ